So for me, my soul is that makes me uniquely me, and it's a conscious agent, and it outlasts the body. So psyche for me is soul, not mind. Delia doesn't mean manifesting; it actually means revealing. So for me, a psychedelic is not mind manifesting; it's soul revealing. Totally different ballpark. It's a totally different game. So I think it's important to get clear around language. Language creates culture. If we want to get the culture right, we have to get the language right. So I would ask, don't take my word for it, look up the etymological root of these words for yourself. So my position on this is that a psychedelic is a soul revealing substance, plant medicine. So in this exciting episode, the plan was to have an intelligent and informative conversation about psychedelic integration. And so I had my executive director sit down with me to interview me about my opinions about psychedelic integration. And that's where I thought it was going, and it went somewhere else. And it really opened up into quite a dynamic, interactive conversation. And it's very clear that we weren't always on the same page or didn't agree in terms of our opinions and points of view. But what I liked and found really compelling about this conversation was that long form conversation is not really about dominating the other person with your opinion, but really sharing points of view. And so I shared my point of view to the ability that I could, as clear as I could, and then Quid did the same. And what's there for you as the audience is you can pick the pieces that worked for you out of this conversation and make of them what you will. So enjoy, if you like dynamic conversations where there's disagreement and differences of opinion, you're going to love this one. Thanks for watching.
That was the best intro.
Yeah, so I've invited this episode because I want to be interviewed by someone who knows me fairly well and what I'm up to with my life, because I've got some things I want to communicate to my audience and let them know a little bit about myself and my opinions on certain things that I'm quite passionate about. And I didn't know how to do that, just speaking to the microphone. And I thought, well, let's trial an interview. It's one thing to interview someone, it's another one to be interviewed. And so I asked you to interview me with certain questions in mind to elicit those kind of responses that I'm hoping to have in this conversation. So it is a setup. It's not a spontaneous conversation.
All right. So then, yeah, for the listeners, to be transparent, I'm inquiring questions that you have that I wouldn't naturally ask. These are directed by you to elicit the responses that you think are beneficial for listeners to hear and important conversations to be had. If there is anything that I naturally and spontaneously want to add, I will. But we'll just start with what you've written out here.
And for the benefit of the audience, if at any time I give you license to take the conversation elsewhere, to push back, because it's an interactive thing. I don't want to be pushing my opinions on people, but I do want to share my opinions, and you can take the audience perspective and challenge me for sure.
All right, cool. So we're going to start with the fact that the Therapeutic Goods Administration, at the request of Mind Medicine Australia, last year rescheduled psilocybin and MDMA to make them available for the treatment of depression and PTSD. As somebody who has a lot of experience with psychedelics, what are your thoughts on this based on your lived experience and your career and your experience treating people? I guess treating people with trauma, seeing the way that seeing where the downfalls of what they may be lacking in terms of if they were able to access these medicines, and then also your experience as somebody who has done the medicines in South America and these other countries.
Sure, it's such a tough question, Quinn. I was hoping you wouldn't open with that one.
Oh, you're a natural.
So Yeah, so I'm excited and alarmed by the developments. I think equally excited as alarmed, and I think it's a bit of a breakthrough bit of legislation, the rescheduling of those two medicines. And so medicines in Australia are covered under the Poisons Act. So the difference between a medicine and a poison is basically the dose. So I'd throw that in there. So under the Poisons Act, Schedule 9 is a poison. So for the last 30 years, MDMA and psilocybin have been locked away in Schedule 9 and been designated a poison. They're not poisonous, so I find that an interesting category for them. In Schedule 9, they can't be prescribed. They are considered to have no medical benefit. They're not available to be prescribed, and they are also considered to be potentially highly addictive and harmful. And so none of those things are true of those two substances. And so at the behest of My Medicine Australia, who lobbied pretty hard to get the TGA to reschedule these down into Schedule 8. So Schedule 8 is a controlled substance. So Schedule 8's things like morphine, even cocaine, I think Schedule 8. So these are still things that are medicines but have to be controlled. It's illegal to possess them without a prescription or to possess them at all. But what it does do, when you take it from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8, it means that now these can be prescribed by authorised psychiatrists, and that's what's opened up just recently. And I think it's this week where the first patient in Australia is being treated for MDMA for PTSD in a clinic in Melbourne. So it's quite topical that we're discussing this right now. And so very exciting times that MDMA has become available for people as a medicine, and also psilocybin, although I have more reservations with psilocybin than I do with MDMA. So the point I want to make is that there's a lot of promises, but there's also pitfalls, and that whilst we've opened this legality up by rescheduling, I don't think we've sorted out the details yet, and they're yet to be worked out. And as a mentor of mine, Jordan Peterson, says, the devil's in the details. So the conversation I want to have today is looking at some of these details in what are we going to do now that we have these two substances available to be used as treatments for mental health issues.
So why do you think that why do you have more reservations with psilocybin than MDMA?
Okay, great. So that brings me to the point that's a really significant point, and I haven't heard anybody bring it up yet. So there's a classification. Medicines are generally classified by the class of medication they're in, like antihypertensive, diabetic medication, antibiotics, etc. So there's a class of medicines or medications called psychedelics. And the reason I want to distinguish this is because MDMA is not a psychedelic. Yet I've seen
But a lot of people do refer to it as psychedelic assisted therapy.
Correct. And so that's why I wanted to make this distinction, because we need to be clear about the language. And so then we need to define psychedelic, which we can go into that. And we will go into that because that's important. So and then we'll look at psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and break that down in terms of language as well. So in order to have an intelligent conversation, we need to be clear about the terms we're using and the definitions of those terms. So no person who knows what they're talking about is going to refer to MDMA as a psychedelic, because it's not a psychedelic. It's actually in a class of its own. They had to invent a new class of medicine for MDMA, and they're not sure what to call it. Some people call it an empathogen or an entactogen. So it's not an antihypertensive, it's not a psychedelic, it's an entactogen or an empathogen.
So what are the different qualities that put it into that new category as opposed to any of the other categories that exist?
Okay, so let's look at why it's not a psychedelic. So we have to first define what is a psychedelic, but we'll start loosely. So things that are psychedelic are things like LSD, psychedelic mushrooms that contain psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, mescaline, things like this. These are the more traditional medicines that are considered psychedelics.
Would you say that cannabis can be a psychedelic?
Cannabis can be a psychedelic, depending on the dose, but for some people, even at low doses. And
That's me.
Yeah, right. So you've had psychedelic experiences.
Absolutely, every time.
Right. Fantastic. And so what do we mean by psychedelic? So I think that's a good place to start. Well, what do we mean by psyche? Let's start there. So there's a couple of schools of thoughts, but the mainstream school of thought, which I don't agree with, is that psyche is mind. I don't agree with that. And so the mainstream people think that psychedelic means mind manifesting. So if you look up psyche, the etymological root of the word, it comes from Greek mythology. There was actually a Greek goddess, Psyche. And she was a mortal woman with immense beauty. And she was a mortal woman, but through the story, and I'm not sure the whole story of the mythology of it, but she was, the god Jupiter made her immortal. And she's considered the goddess of the soul. So if something's mortal and becomes immortal, to me that points towards soul, not mind. I'm pretty sure that when the body dies and the brain dies, I'm pretty confident the mind also dies.
So what is your definition of mind?
Mind is the function of brain. So brain's the structure, mind is the function. So the brain has a structure and a function. So when brain dies, mind dies. Mind is, like I said, the function of the brain, all the functions that come under the brain. So what's the soul? And some people might even think we don't have a soul, but, the question about whether we have a soul or not's been around for 2,000 years and it's not going away. It's been around longer than that. So the clue comes from Greek mythology, where this mortal woman was made immortal and she was considered the goddess of the soul, and her name's Psyche. So for me, psyche refers to our soul, not our mind. What's our soul? You could do a whole podcast on that. But for me, it's the animating spirit that's in this meat skeleton. So I believe I have a soul. I believe there's a drop of consciousness in me that comes from the ocean of consciousness. When I die, that drop of consciousness will return to the ocean of consciousness. I might have lost half the audience by now. I don't care. So for me, my soul is that makes me uniquely me, and it's a conscious agent, and it outlasts the body. So psyche for me is soul, not mind. Delia doesn't mean manifesting. It actually means revealing. So for me, a psychedelic is not mind manifesting. It's soul revealing. Totally different ballpark. Totally different game. So I think it's important to get clear around language. Language creates culture. If we want to get the culture right, we have to get the language right. So I would ask, don't take my word for it, look up the etymological root of these words for yourself. So my position on this is that a psychedelic is a soul-revealing substance, plant medicine, whatever. As you mentioned, that I've been to Mexico nearly half a dozen times, Costa Rica, Peru, and while I was there, I had many psychedelic experiences. And in those experiences, what was going on, from what I could glean, is that my soul was being revealed to me. And what is my soul? What is my psyche? It's this vast realm of unfathomable, unimaginable content that seems to contain the whole history of humanity in some sort of collective space. And it's full of archetypes and imagery and spiritual visions and symbolism, and such a vast realm. It's hard to define what the soul or the psyche is. But you can experience it when you take a psychedelic. And so...
Question.
Yes, please.
Quite a deep philosophical question. So if the soul is the eternal, all-enduring drop of consciousness that is within us, that is from the one source, then if you're experiencing the soul in a psychedelic journey and it's showing you all of these images that are not always, but often revealing earthly or material things or things that are of this place, do you think if the soul isn't from this place and is inherently separate, and the aspect of us that is material is what we're having revealed to us in those experiences, maybe it's not the soul that you're witnessing, because the soul isn't made up of these images and archetypes that are related to the material realm?
Great question. So, when you say the soul's not from this place and not from this material realm.
Oh, well, it's separate to the physical. It's separate in that it is not physical.
So
it is here,
yeah,
because it is. I believe that all of the realms are simultaneously existing all the time. We don't have visual access to them, but it's not like here's the earth and then like heaven's over there, like spirituality's over there. It just is always all encompassing. So it is here, but it's also not physical, and it's not. Yeah, it is, I guess, the realm, in my opinion, where the soul is existing is so far removed from the physical. Yeah, no,
it's not.
Matter.
It's actually one and the same in a way. Although it's separate, it's one in the same and separate. So let me try and explain this, and these are not easy questions to answer. So if you follow the scientific reductionist approach to material reality, they will lead you to believe that in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was a big bang, and then everything got created out of nothing. And right after the big bang, there was just all this plasma, and then over billions of years that plasma cooled and condensed into gases, and those gases formed solids, and those solids formed planets and gaseous suns and all the rest of it. And then on some third planet from a distant sun, there was the perfect environment to create life, and life emerged in the oceans of Earth and crawled out of the oceans and became mammals, and then humans developed this brain that had a cortex on it, and then that cortex of the human brain created consciousness, and that the consciousness is a product and function of the human brain. That's what the reductionist scientists would lead you to believe. There's zero evidence for that. There's zero evidence, scientific evidence, that the human brain produces or creates conscious experience.
I absolutely don't think that's the way that it is.
No, nor do I. So I think it's if it's anything, it's closer to the opposite of that. I think consciousness is primary and fundamental. I think consciousness creates everything, including the material realm. So what we experience as the material realm is a creation of consciousness. So there's now consciousness can be experienced as an individual consciousness. So you experience yourself as Quinn, I experience myself as Pete. I see the world through the lens of Pete. But that's because the drop of consciousness that's in me is being filtered through the ego or the lens of Pete, this construct. I've had an experience when I was in Mexico where I smoked the venom from the Sonoran desert toad, Bufo alvarius, and the compound in that 5-MeO-DMT. If you smoke enough of that, and I'm not recommending people do this, by the way, you will leave your body. You will have a complete ego death. And my experience was that my consciousness was no longer in my body for about 12 minutes of earth time, but where I went, there was no time or space really, but there was pure consciousness. In that experience, Pete as a subject disappeared. And it's the only time in my life where I've had an experience that was unity consciousness. There was no duality. There was no me in the experience, subject and object. There was just pure consciousness. And in the Vedic literature, they have a term for this, which yogis can get to through meditation, called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat being the ultimate truth, Chit meaning pure consciousness, Ananda meaning bliss. And that was exactly my experience, that I had become pure consciousness and that was the absolute truth. And that it was blissful. And in that experience, there was no me. I had become one with everything. Now, this sounds crazy and outlandish, and it's impossible that this can even happen. But the only way I can describe this is that it was as though the drop of consciousness in me went out through my crown chakra and returned to the ocean of consciousness from where it came. And when I was there, which I wasn't because I was gone, but there was just unity consciousness, being one with everything. This is what the yogis describe when they get to nirvana or moksha or or samadhi. So
what were you seeing anything there?
Yeah, there was definitely a visual. So I've done that. I've had that experience twice, and although the content of the experience was different, the things that were consistent was a unity consciousness experience without me being present. So in the first experience, I just went black. What it's doing from a neurophysiological point of view is it's turning off the default mode network, which is the part of your brain that holds the construct of self or the identity or the ego. They've mapped this out fairly well. And so it dials down the default mode network. So self, there's no ego anymore. So self gets taken offline. And as I said, we experience reality through the filter of self or through the filter of ego. So without that filter, without that ego, without that taken offline, that drop of consciousness, who knows for what reason, has this experience of no longer being Pete. And then what's beyond Pete becomes possible to experience. And so I blacked out. The first thought was that I've done it. I've just killed myself with a lethal dose of something. That was the fear. But then there was this sound like someone had struck a tuning fork. Bing! And when I heard that sound, next thing there was this universe. Like it was predominantly black space with some stars and galaxies in it. And my consciousness is that. So I could see blackness, even though I had no eyes and no body. I could see distant galaxies and stars and space. And I could also see, through symbolism, I could see that everything was there, nothing was missing. There was war and peace, God and the devil, good and bad, right and wrong, up and down. Everything was there. But it was there in pure harmony. So there was no problem with war. There was no problem with peace. It somehow exists in a pure harmonic unity consciousness as a play of consciousness. The pain and suffering, I think, happens is when we're in the body because the body experiences pain through attaching and aversion and desire and all the rest of it, illness, whatever. And so this experience of unity consciousness contained everything. There was nothing missing. And the experience was blissful. And so that's why I have a concept of what's behind this physical reality is a metaphysical reality or pure consciousness, and that pure consciousness creates the illusion of a material reality. And so coming back to, I want to relate that back to the soul. And so whilst there is this ocean of consciousness, the ocean of consciousness, for whatever reason, boredom, I don't know, wanted to create a bunch of individual experiences, and so puts a drop of consciousness in each human, or maybe animals too, I don't know. And so that we get to have this game that we're playing here with being an animated body with a conscious, being a conscious agent. And so when I take a psychedelic, what I think is happening, so I don't, and they can measure this through functional MRIs with most psychedelics. People think that when you take a psychedelic, it increases neural activity in the brain. So you're getting an increase in activity, and that's why you're seeing all that stuff. No, it's not the case. There's a decrease in activity in the brain when you take psychedelics, particularly in the default mode network. So it's not a manifestation of more neural output. It's a dialing down of neural output, in particular in relation to the ego and the default mode network. So when you take away the noise of the ego, what's behind it, the deeper signal can come through. And that deeper signal is what's behind the ego or sense of self. And that's the higher self. Like, I'm not just my ego. I'm not just this construct, this identity of Pete. That's not who I am. And so I'll just segue for a moment because we're right at a critical point here. So what psychedelics have taught me, if anything, is that I'm not who I thought I was. That who I thought I was or who I think I am is really just one aspect of me, and that's my ego or identity, or what Jung referred to as the persona. So I used to think I was just my persona. But when you take psychedelics as many times as I have, that persona or that mask falls away and reveals what's behind the mask. And what's behind the mask, Jung referred to as the shadow. So through taking psychedelics, I've encountered deeper parts of myself that are beyond the superficial layer, parts of myself that I've lost, disowned, rejected, repressed, denied. So psychedelics reveal more of your true self to you.
Which, based on what you're saying though, all of that identity, that is really all identity, even whether it's the shadow identity or the persona identity, and that's still not actually you.
Correct.
So it's, if we are pure source, pure spirit, pure whatever it is, whatever people want to call it, then even seeing your shadow, the unconscious, having these unconscious parts made conscious, that's still not you.
Correct. But it's more of me than I could see before.
Or more
of the construct of me. So yeah, I believe we create our own ego, and I believe we create our own shadow. But that's not the full content of the psyche or the soul. They're just some contents of it. So there's a thing that Jung referred to as the collective unconscious. So I have my personal unconscious, but there's also a collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, to make that demonstratable, how we can say that there's a collective unconscious, is because we have these archetypes that are consistent cross-culturally and across time, where things like the hero or the villain, they're archetypes. Now, they will appear in the unconscious of, any culture, any person in any culture, no matter how far away they are. And there's, other archetypes apart from the hero and then the villain, the king, the jester. There's all these archetypes that will show up. And there's consistent symbolism. So the language of the unconscious mind isn't language, it's more like symbols or imagery. And so there's certain symbols and imagery that occur in different cultures that have been isolated from each other for tens of thousands of years. The rainbow serpent is one of them. So the rainbow serpent is in the indigenous Australian culture. It's also in the North American culture, and it's also in the voodoo culture of Africa, this idea of a rainbow serpent. So that points to this collective unconscious as being another aspect of the psyche, the human psyche. So I can't tell you everything that the human psyche contains. I'm not that clever. But I do want to distinguish that the mind is purely the computational part of the brain, the function of the brain that helps us function in this 3D reality. But when you take a psychedelic, you're not using your brain to do computational work. You're having deeper aspects of you revealed to you, including your shadow, but then also some of the content of this unconscious, collective unconscious. So symbolisms, like I've seen deities, gods, goddesses, archetypes, very hyper-real visions. And so the psyche is this vast realm. It's not just the shadow and the ego, they're just components of it. So the reason I'm making this distinction is because my concern around psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, so I don't even like that terminology, and I'll explain why. So Carl Jung says this too, and he was one of the deepest thinkers of our time. He said the psyche is such an unfathomable realm that no one person could hope to ever even come close to mapping it or understanding it. And so psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is an interesting phrase. So psychotherapy implies that I understand your psyche well enough that I can come up with tools, therapeutic tools, to analyze your psyche, to assist you in treating your mental health.
So just to clarify, when you say psyche, are you saying soul?
Yeah.
They're the same terms for you.
Yeah.
But were you not just saying that soul is pure consciousness?
No, soul's not pure consciousness, no. So my soul, what I refer to as my soul, is purely a subset of the overarching soul. So the pure consciousness is the ocean of consciousness. Mm-hmm. A drop of that distills in each of us, and then that drop of consciousness is no longer pure. It is conscious because it's going to be filtered through the construct of self, the ego. So I'm a body, I'm a carnate, meat skeleton, and I've got this drop of consciousness in me. So I'm going to experience consciousness through this personal conscious agent. So that's why when my default mode net got switched off and that drop of consciousness returned to the ocean of consciousness, I wasn't there. That was when I had a pure conscious experience, because it was unity consciousness. But when the drop is incarnate in the body, it's not pure conscious.
But consciousness is just observing. It just is. Yes, you're observing all of the layers and the identities and the ego and this and this and this in your Pete self, and that's what we're seeing. But the consciousness just is watching that. The consciousness just is. It's not anything. And it is just that drop of awareness, of witnessing, of being able to perceive what is happening as an objective outsider. So how can the consciousness been tainted if it just is consciousness?
Because it's being filtered through the lens of the person. So the brain is involved in conscious experience. The brain is definitely involved in conscious experience. They've mapped this using functional MRI. So you can smell coffee or feel pain or, taste strawberries, and it'll produce a certain picture in the brain. And so the closest thing they have is what they call neural correlates of consciousness. So they can look at certain maps of the brain in terms of how the brain lights up while you're having these conscious experiences. So the brain's definitely involved in conscious experience, but it's not producing the experience. So your brain is involved in conscious experience. So the drop of consciousness in me is expressing itself through my brain activity, which includes my default mode network, which includes my sense of self. So I'm a conscious agent, but I'm not pure consciousness because I have a subjective viewpoint.
You're not pure consciousness, but you have consciousness which allows you to perceive in a conscious way. And that is just what it is. It's it just is the awareness. Without the awareness, all the other stuff still keeps going, but we're just not conscious of it. It's like, it's just eyes to see, whereas, animals don't have consciousness, which is what separates us. They don't have conscious awareness of themselves, that they are an animal experiencing this reality. They just are it, which is why we're different, because we have conscious awareness that we are an animal experiencing this reality. So, and that just is consciousness. It's not anything that can be tainted. The only way that consciousness could be tainted is if you lose it, or if you all of a sudden aren't conscious.
Maybe it's the word tainted, filtered.
But the consciousness is just watching. It's not
okay,
the consciousness that's...
So even the fact that we're disagreeing now demonstrates my point, because are you conscious?
I am conscious.
Okay, am I conscious?
Yeah.
Is your conscious pure?
Yeah, well, the consciousness is.
Is my consciousness pure?
Absolutely.
How come we're not agreeing?
Because
if we both have pure, crystal clear consciousness.
But I think maybe we're using the word consciousness with a different definition. Because for me, consciousness is like I just said, it's just the ability to perceive with an objective awareness. So it's being able to separate the subject and basically observing the self. That just is consciousness. Returning to full consciousness would mean that we are beyond the ego, beyond all of the identities that we've created here. So we're not full consciousness.
So I think you're describing the difference between duality and unity consciousness. So duality consciousness is what you and I are experiencing now.
Yes.
Because we're a subject and we're experiencing an objective world. So there's subject and object. And so that's duality. What I'm talking about is non-duality, what they call non-duality or unity consciousness.
Totally, and I'm not saying that we're that. I'm saying that we have consciousness, but the consciousness can never been tainted. We're in a space of duality where there is separateness, and we're observing that separateness, and we're not in unity consciousness. We haven't dissolved back into oneness, because we are still this drop of source within a physical vessel which has identities in it. Yep. And we're observing those identities, but that's not tainting or touching the pure conscious awareness that witnesses those identities. That pure conscious awareness that gets to witness doesn't get tainted. You can just but there's layers that as you remove those identities and the traumas and the things blocking it, you can become more and more conscious and become more and more aware of how...
Okay, so...
But the consciousness is always intact.
Okay, so let's get rid of the word tainted. So if you can become more conscious through dealing with traumas and things like that, or meditation, or then...
Well, you can become more aware of the consciousness that already exists and is inherent.
Okay, all right. So you can be more or less conscious rather than tainted or filtered.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm happy to change the language around that.
So do you see what I'm saying about how the consciousness is always as it is? It never changes. But we can connect with it more and realize it more and get closer to it by removing these identities. But it is always one and the same, and it is always that drop of consciousness regardless. It never changes.
Okay, so a metaphor for that would be that, say there's a pane of glass here, a window, and my pure consciousness is just on the side of it, and that window's a bit dirty, and so I can't really see my pure consciousness. It's always pure. It's always there as pure. But the dirt on the window is my traumas, my desires and aversions and all the other stuff, and my ignorance and all that. And that if I was able to work through that stuff and clean that window, I would see that consciousness was always pure.
Yes.
Is that what you're describing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, look, I'm happy to support that position. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wanting to I feel like in these conversations of talking about psyche and soul, it is beneficial to have a very, very clear definition of what is being discussed, because it is so subjective for a lot of people. It can be.
Absolutely.
A lot of people have different opinions on this, and they could be hearing a completely different conversation if it's not defined what these terms actually mean to us while we're speaking about it.
Yes. Okay. So look, I'm happy to say that my use of the word tainted consciousness is doesn't work for this conversation, and that I guess for me it's more that my consciousness is affected by the filter of self or the ego, so that
your access to it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Correct. Yeah, because I'm looking at it through a filter, and so when the default mode network goes offline and that filter's gone, then pure consciousness is available. At least that was what I believe happened. So, and just to reiterate this point a little, it is definitely possible for the consciousness to leave the body, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence or documented cases of people watching their surgery, leaving their body and going up to the roof of the operating theatre and being able to describe what they witnessed during their surgery. Women have been sexually assaulted, have said they watched their rape from above, and and so there's this whole concept of the consciousness being able to leave the body or translocate, which was my experience when I used the 5-MeO DMT. There's another wonderful account by Stanislav Grof in his book When the Impossible Happens. He was at Esalen Institute in California, and this guy's a professor of psychiatry and psychology. I think he's about 95 years old. He's still on the talks, still is a keynote speaker, attending conferences. And he talks about taking a very large dose of LSD, which is a psychedelic, 1,200 micrograms I think he took. He was in his room, in his cabin at Esalen at the time, and he took this large dose of LSD, and the next thing was he noticed his consciousness was no longer in his body because it had translocated to a towel. And that towel was in the bathhouse at Esalen. And in the bathhouse there was a jacuzzi, and there were 4 professors in the jacuzzi that night having a conversation. And Stanislav Grof's consciousness was in an inanimate object, a towel hanging on a towel rack in a bathroom. And the next morning at breakfast, Stanislav Grof went up to these 4 professors and says, "Oh, you guys were in the bathhouse last night and you were having a conversation. This is what you were talking about." He says, "How could you know that? You weren't there." And he said, "Yeah, I was in the towel."
So, I mean, I'm just trying to decide which things to pull on, because this is supposed to be a conversation about psychedelic integration. However, it's going on a crazy tangent, which I did disclose.
You'd warned me that would happen, yeah. And we're not on that much of a tangent, really.
I mean, yeah, we can bring it all back in a beautiful way and tie it up. So, if his consciousness went into a towel, is that not to say, with the nature of consciousness being unmaterial, consciousness everywhere all at once, beyond time and space, because it's only the material form that operates in a linear time way. And when you go into the other realms, it's everything, there is no time, it just is all happening all at once, eternal, there is no time. That in that process of him taking the psychedelic, it didn't change it changed the quality of his consciousness, but that is always possible. And his consciousness actually is always in the towel. But by having the psychedelic, it removed the barriers that he's usually operating with that allow him to be able to be aware that he is in the towel. Because if
consciousness is creating everything, then his consciousness may have created the illusion that he was in the towel, but then that doesn't explain how he was able to recount the conversation. So there's a theory that we hallucinate our reality. So that I'm imagining that you're there and that I'm talking to you, and that even though you appear that you're over there, this is all taking place apparently in my brain through my eyes and my optical receptors, and that image of you is back here in my brain, and then it's upside down, so I have to reverse it, then I have to project it back out there to see you as over there. So it's quite an interactive experience. And so my consciousness may be creating my experience and my reality, or consciousness working through my neural system, which is my brain and my eyes, to create the illusion of I'm speaking to you over there and you're another conscious agent, as opposed to that you're physically there. And then, so there's another way of looking at this. So, and this gets really complex and it may go beyond the scope of this. So Professor Donald Hoffman, who's a perceptual psychologist at UC Irvine in California, has shown pretty conclusively through mathematical models that the probability that humans see reality as it is exactly zero. So not close to zero, it's exactly zero. So we're not seeing reality as it is. So then what are we seeing? Well, it's a perception. You know, we're perceiving a low resolution set of signals that's within a certain bandwidth of light, sound, you know, whatever our senses are capable of perceiving. And, you know, we perceive things one way, but a bat does things through echolocation, a snake through thermal signatures, seeing, you know, heat instead of light. So which is the real reality? Well, they're all a reality, but we're all seeing a different reality. And then you see a different reality than I see. So when we're trying to define these things, we're trying to define reality. But the chances that we can see reality as it is exactly zero. So it's a conversation that can only go so far before it all kind of falls over.
Can be.
Yeah. So I want to bring this back to, if I can, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and psychedelic integration. So, and maybe the conversation we've already had will be helpful and useful. So in Australia, they've recently opened up the laws to make psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybin, available for treatment-resistant depression. And they're going to start treating people with psilocybin, which is a psychedelic. And the reason I said that I feel cautionary around this is because the difference between psychedelics and, say, something like MDMA is that psychedelics disorganize your ego. So when you take MDMA, you're in your normal frame of mind. You're just more open and less defended. But you're not seeing things that aren't there and your ego's intact. When you take psychedelics, your ego, there's some amount of ego dissolution or ego disorganization. So you're not solely just your normal sense of self, and you have access to other aspects of psyche, shadow, collective unconscious. You can see visions that aren't there. You can project those visions into your perceptual field, and they're not just going on in your head, they're actually going on in the room, and things look different. You can have mystical visions. There's a whole bunch of content that comes out of a psychedelic experience, and you're in a disorganized state. Now, that can be profoundly healing, and for some people it is. However, it can also be challenging to interpret or integrate those experiences, and for some people those experiences can be uncomfortable, distressing, and potentially even traumatic. So I think there was one study that showed 20% of people that had a psychedelic dose of mushrooms described it as a bad trip. So my take on that, based on what I've already said previously, is that when you take a psychedelic, you don't necessarily have a bad trip. I don't think that's the right language. So if we go back to my model, which is that you're just revealing aspects of your soul to you when you take a psychedelic, they just saw an aspect of the soul or the psyche that disturbed them or made them feel uncomfortable, or it appeared to them as threatening.
But is the soul not pure consciousness? Is that not what we were just talking about?
No, the soul is not pure consciousness. So there's a drop of consciousness from the ocean of consciousness that animates the carnate body. So, and look, so I'm not even professing to have the expertise to map the cartography of the psyche and the soul. Like, Jung's the best proponent of this, and if you really want the deepest answers to these questions, read Jung. And Jung is not easy to read. I'm reading his book at the moment on the nature of the psyche. Tough read. I'm halfway through and still struggling. So we don't have clear definitions for psyche or soul.
Okay, so just to clarify,
or consciousness,
that your definition of soul and psyche are one and the same.
Correct, psyche and soul.
And you don't perceive that as pure consciousness.
No.
Okay.
No, not necessarily. No.
Okay.
No. What you refer to as pure consciousness, I see that as there's an ocean of consciousness, and we have one drop of that distilled into us, and that when that bit of consciousness is in us, we have a subjective consciousness because we have a subjective viewpoint. When that drop leaves and goes back to the ocean of consciousness, it's non-dual. There's no subject. Then it's pure conscious. So when that drop of consciousness is in me, I can be. What am I conscious of? Well, without a psychedelic, I'm conscious of so much. With a psychedelic, I become conscious of more. I see more of the psyche. I'm more conscious of deeper aspects of the psyche or soul. So I see deeper into myself.
So not the identity. You're not seeing more of the identity. You're seeing more of the soul.
Some of it's identity, because I believe that both my shadow and my persona are both parts of my identity. Mm-hmm. My shadow is just a part of my identity that I've rejected.
Yes.
But there's not just shadow and ego in the psyche or soul. There's all sorts. There's the collective unconscious. There's.
So the shadow and the ego are part of the psyche and soul.
Yes, they are. That they are.
Just a moment for thought.
Yeah, no,
we're still live.
Well, no, absolutely. No, you're asking really deep.
Deep questions. People might be like, "Has it ended?
Well,
Is something wrong with the audio?"
So
just letting them know we're still going.
It's a very deep question, and to which I don't profess to have the answers to. I mean, these are just conversations, and no one has the answers to it. I'm
just bringing it back to this because we did just talk about this, but I feel like we got to a clear definition, and now that's just reverted and changed again.
How's it changed?
So. Well, I was under the impression that we got clear that we were both defining soul as pure consciousness, and when it comes into the body, it's behind the window pane that's dirty. It's still completely pure, completely intact, and though that dirt on the window is identity, ego, shadow, all of this stuff, traumas, all of these things, but they're the part of the jewel. So that's the material, and then the soul is always perfect, intact consciousness in the body that goes back to the ocean of consciousness, and it's always pure. But it's just coming and observing this jewel experience, and it's observing it, and that's what it's doing, but it's intact.
It depends on your definition of pure. Okay, so let's unpack this. So I think I know where you're going with this and my position on it. So it's pure. It's pure when it's the ocean of consciousness. That drop of consciousness is pure before it leaves the ocean of consciousness. Once it is distilled into the body, pure maybe not the right word. It's not that it's not pure or that it's tainted, but it's now not possible to be perceived as unity consciousness, because it's now subjective.
Yes, of course, but it's still just the observer that hasn't changed form from when it was in the oneness. The form still remains exactly the same, but now it's perceiving something else because it's got this dual experience that's happening. So it is now perceiving a subject, whereas when it was in the oneness, it wasn't perceiving anything,
Correct.
it just was.
Yeah.
But it hasn't changed quality.
No.
When it's come into this experience of duality and being the observer, it's still exactly the same. It's just perceiving a subject
Through a subject, correct. Yes. So it's not exactly the same because it's now experiencing itself through a conscious agent. So it's the same substrate, it comes from the same place, but being a subject, so having a subjective experience is not the same as having a unity experience.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, they're not equal.
Mm-hmm.
So the drop of consciousness in me that is aware, that sees, comes from an ocean of consciousness, but the moment it's incarnate in my body, it's separate from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see how it can...
But the consciousness isn't where the shadow and the ego and anything is going.
No.
The consciousness is just observing
The shadow
all of
and
those
the ego.
things. It's
correct.
But it is always fundamentally separate, cannot connect, cannot merge, cannot become one, because the consciousness is.
Yeah, the consciousness isn't the soul or the psyche.
Okay, well, there's another distinction.
Yeah, the consciousness is the function of perception of those things. So when I had a unity consciousness experience, it was just pure perception of the absolute truth, which is pure consciousness, which is bliss. That's a perceptual experience, but it's not perception through the eyes of Pete necessarily, because I didn't experience myself as being there. So yeah, for me there's a difference between
so
consciousness
and soul are not the same to you.
No,
Okay.
Soul and psyche are the same.
Okay.
So
then what is soul and psyche?
So the subjective experience of the drop of consciousness.
Subjective experience of the
drop of consciousness in the individual.
So once the drop of consciousness enters the body, it becomes a soul.
Yeah.
And then, but is it not still unchanged consciousness?
No, it's changed because it's now subjective.
But the ego is not part of it.
Part of what?
The soul.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. The ego becomes part of the soul when it incarnates into...
Even though what we just said was that it does still remain, when that consciousness comes into the body, it is separate. And it is perceiving...
It can leave the body.
Ego, and it is perceiving the shadow, but it is not the shadow and the ego. It is purely perceiving it. And it's having this experience of the observer and the subject being the ego and the shadow. So the soul, which is still separate from the identities, from the soul, from the shadow, from the ego, those things are all there. And then there's the soul, which is still separate, and that's what creates the duality.
What creates the duality is that the drop of consciousness leaves the ocean of consciousness. It splits off from a unified experience.
And goes into the physical.
Mm-hmm. So once that happens, there's now a new conscious agent that experiences itself as separate. Maybe it's not even separate, but because there's duality, it's I don't feel connected to that experience that I had when I had that unity consciousness experience. Once I returned, I was no longer, I no longer experienced myself as pure consciousness. I came back into the body and experienced myself as Pete. So I don't know if we're talking about the same thing and it's just semantics, but when that drop of consciousness incarnates into the body...
It is still the observer, not the subject, though. Because if there was no observer, then there'd be nothing to observe and we wouldn't be conscious. If it became one with the subject and it became the shadow and it became the ego, there would be no...
So you're suggesting that the drop of consciousness is the observer and is the subject?
No.
You're not saying
the drop of consciousness is the observer, the soul, the drop that's come from the one ocean. And it's observing the shadow, the ego, the identity, all these layers that we've picked up, the material world, but it is not that. It is observing it, but it is not that. The subject is the ego, the shadow, etc., and the observer is the soul, the consciousness. Because if it wasn't, then there's nothing. It just becomes one. There's no consciousness. There's nothing to observe. And you talk about the witnessing self and being able to observe the shadow knowing you are not it. So who is that?
Well, when you say I'm not the shadow, I can be the shadow. I can be the ego. I can experience myself as those things.
But you're not... Okay, so then you talk about I'm not angry, I'm feeling angry. Mm-hmm. Because we are not angry, we're pure consciousness.
Anger is, to feel angry is a conscious experience. So I'm aware that I'm feeling angry is a conscious experience. So there's a subject being the person who's feeling angry, and then the objective thing is the anger, which whether it's experienced as a fast heart rate or heat or stress.
Is that not still the subjective experience? And the objective is witnessing that happening?
So the subject is the self that's witnessing it, and the object is the
subject
content.
is the anger, the feelings, the body, all of these things that are happening. So the subject is so angry, racing heart rate, all these things, and the observer is watching that happening. Witnessing it and being able to go, I'm not going to react, I'm going to respond. Because I can witness this and I can see it, and I'm going to step back, and that's my conscious awareness that's separate from the experience, able to make a higher level decision and not just act from impulse, because I do have that conscious awareness that is separate.
No, that's not how I see it. Yeah, so if I'm experiencing anger, so I'm subjectively, so there's me, I'm the subject. To me, the anger is the object, and that I'm subjectively experiencing anger. I'm not the anger. Anger is a feeling. I'm not a feeling. I'm the feeler of the feeling. So therefore, I am not anger. I am feeling anger, and that feeler, which is the feeler is a conscious experience, and the feeling is that neural correlate of consciousness. It's the object of the perception. So that's what I mean by subject and object, and that when I talk about having an object, you want to have a strong witnessing self that can separate the subject from the object.
So who's witnessing?
Who's doing the witnessing?
Yeah.
The subject. Oh, okay, so I hear what you're saying. So the higher self or the conscious agent is able to distinguish the subject from the object.
So would that be to say the soul or the consciousness is the witnessing self?
Yeah, potentially, yeah. Yeah, potentially that the conscious agent is the higher self, and the higher self is able to see two aspects of the lower self, which could be subject and object, or shadow and persona. And so I think Jung uses the term the higher self, and maybe that higher self is that witnessing conscious agent. Is that useful?
Well, I mean, it is. Do you see, where does the higher self fit in? Is it consciousness, or is it part of the dual experience. So if the dual experience is there is just consciousness and then there's everything else, is the higher self in the everything else, or is it in the consciousness or the soul?
Yeah. So I don't have Jung's map with me here, but Jung has...
In your opinion?
In my opinion. So the higher self to me is, if anything, it's the conscious agent expressing itself through this individual. That's why it's a self. Your higher self would be different to my higher self. That's why higher self is not unity consciousness.
So would you say the higher self is still an identity that can operate in the persona? It's not consciousness. It is still an identity in this dual experience.
The higher self would be an interface between pure consciousness and the lower self, or the identity of self.
So it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So there's a third thing.
I don't know how many different things there are. And like I said, I don't even really have the answers to nobody has the answers to most of these questions, and we're doing, a rigorous inquiry into this, and maybe coming up empty-handed at the end of it. But the reason I want to have this conversation is because I'm curious about the opening up of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for mental health conditions.
So just to go back to where we were before that opened up, we were at the point where you were saying people can have there's no such thing as a bad trip. So people can have these experiences where they're seeing more of themselves and then they don't know what to do with that.
Correct, yeah. Or they feel alarmed or scared or afraid or distressed. Yeah, so I've had many bad trips. I just don't refer to them as bad trips. I've had some pretty horrendous experiences taking psychedelics, and this is why I don't recommend that people take psychedelics. I neither encourage nor discourage people to take psychedelics. I don't know who psychedelics are going to be useful for or who they're going to be harmful to. People have to work that out for themselves, and that's one of my cautionary positions on this whole realm opening up. There's a lot of benefits to people using psychedelics for healing. There's also a lot of pitfalls. This is the whole idea of having this conversation to see if we can look at what they might be.
So in your opinion, what does effective psychedelic integration look like to you?
Okay, so
if somebody's gone, they've had a psychedelic experience, assisted or unassisted, what would you say the after work of that, the integration looks like for that period?
Sure. So we have to look at what does integration mean. Integration means to bring separate parts together. So to disintegrate is to come apart. To integrate is to put back together. So what is it that we're integrating when we're integrating a psychedelic experience? I haven't come across an intelligent answer to that yet. And the closest I've heard is that, we're integrating the psychedelic experience. What is it about the psychedelic experience that you're trying to put back together? What are the component parts that are disparate that need to be rejoined? Doesn't make sense to me in that context. So the model, the most useful model that I've been able to come up with, and this is after doing hundreds of psychedelic journeys myself and encountering the darkest aspects of my personal shadow, is that all I'm putting back together, all I'm integrating is disparate aspects of self. I'm putting myself back together. It's not the experience that needs to be integrated. It's what that experience showed me in terms of what am I as a being? What am I made up of? So people who say they have a bad trip, what I think is happening is they're encountering aspects of the psyche or soul, in particular possibly aspects of their shadow, and that the shadow by definition is hidden. It can also be dark. It can also be monstrous. So in the collective unconscious of mankind, I think are all the stories of Hitler, Mao Zedong, Stalin, all the murder, all the rape, all the pillage, all the things that has happened to mankind, all that content of all that diabolical, demonic aspect of humanity is in the collective unconscious. And so I've had journeys where I've experienced that stuff. In one psychedelic journey, I was the perpetrator of every crime of a human against another human. And interestingly, when I had that experience, my intention for that psychedelic experience was to integrate the darkest aspect of my shadow. And so what I was shown was that inside me is a perpetrator, a murderer, a monster. It was very difficult integration, because a experience like that can be quite distressing, and for some people would lead to PTSD. I certainly had a difficult time integrating that experience. It probably took me a couple of years to... It wasn't the experience I had to integrate. I had to integrate that aspect of my psyche, my soul, which is the shadow of the monster in humanity.
But that's not part of your soul. That's part of the identity that your soul's observing.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
you're not it's not what was revealed in your soul.
It's a content of the collective unconscious. Where's the collective unconscious? Is it in the brain? Unlikely. You know, are these things even spatial? Do we have to find a location for it? Are we trying to put things that don't have a location in a place? So when I had this psychedelic experience where I encountered being this demonic force that was murdering people, I had to somehow make sense of that experience. That vision was more than just a vision, it was palpable. And so how do I make sense of that? Well, I got very interested in shadow. You know, I read a lot of Jung stuff on the shadow because I wanted to understand that aspect in me. And it showed me that, yeah, I can pretend to be this caring, compassionate, loving, supportive, generous human being, which is what my persona generally is, but that's not all I am, and I'd be a fool to think that's all what I am in total. So,
which is none of it, because you're a pure conscious being.
Yeah, great, but I don't experience myself as that most of the time, and I don't think anybody does. Unless you're meditating 23 hours out of the day, you might experience that. If you withdraw from the experience of being in the body and sit in a pure meditative state, you may experience long periods of bliss, and I've done that. When I did my Kriya and Kundalini yoga, I experienced hours and hours of bliss. But in order to do that, I had to shut off all my senses. So the first part of meditation is pratyahara. It's shutting off from the senses. So you're shutting off from the world, and you can just go into a blissful state, and you can experience that. You can experience what it's like to be this beautiful, soulful experience. But we live in a world. You know, we when the drop of consciousness came in the body, we're having this earthly experience. And, you know, if you're in Gaza at the moment, or if you're in the Ukraine at the moment, you're in hell, not heaven. And these are very human experiences. And so psychedelics reveal to me the true nature of what it is to have a human experience, and that while a lot of us would love to profess that we're angels, we have inside us a monster. We have inside us a shadow. This is what psychedelics have shown me. And I read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, and where, you know, he documents somewhere between 40 and 60 million people being killed in Russia under Stalin. And these were family members killing family members, you know. So, you know, the capacity for monstrosity in humans is, you know, it's in this generation. It's not distant history. And each of us have this in us, and there's a quote in that book that says, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. And so when I had this psychedelic experience where I was the perpetrator murdering people on the battlefield, I saw that. I saw that the line between good and evil runs in between my own heart. And so that influenced me really significantly into really wanting to explore my shadow, the hidden parts of self that I don't want to look at, that are uncomfortable to look at, that in me potentially is a rapist, a murderer, a pedophile, all of it as potential. And I think that's true for all of us. And so that has set me on this trajectory of my own personal shadow work, but also speaking to other people about the potential for them to look at themselves if they're interested in doing shadow work. And so it's not all doom and gloom and murder and rape and pillage. There's a lot of other stuff in there too, that just aspects of self that we deny or suppress that are preventing us from being more authentically ourself, not our higher self, our human self. And so what some people might refer to as a bad trip may be an opportunity for deep healing, in terms of you're exposed to some of your shadow, and that shadow wants to be integrated. But if you run from it because you're scared of it and you're calling it a bad trip, you're less likely to integrate it. So what I see, the best working model I have for psychedelic integration is shadow integration. I don't see them as separate things. So we're opening up this therapeutic space, landscape of giving people these psychedelics. Who's going to be providing that experience? Who's going to be sitting for that person? Are these people that have taken the psychedelics themselves? Are these people that not just have maps but also know the territory? Are these academics? Are these professors but they've never actually had the experience? Or are these going to be people that have had lots of psychedelic experiences? How are you going to support somebody in that process of going into those psychedelic spaces unless you've been there yourself and you can understand or have some rudimentary understanding of what they're experiencing and what those aspects of self represent? So a psychedelic journey or psychedelic therapy session has 3 phases. So there's preparation. You need to prepare the person. There's the initiation, which is the actual experience, and then there's the integration. This is the current model in which MAPS are doing their work, although they're working with MDMA. But the way they're doing it, and this is how the shamans, indigenous people, work with psychedelics. There's a preparation stage, an initiation, and then an integration. So,
can you do a brief overview of what those might involve?
Okay,
Very brief.
Yes, okay, sure. So if you're going to use a psychedelic, there's 3 components there. There's the actual medicine, then there's the set, and the setting. So the set is the mindset. What mindset, what intention are you coming to this experience with? Because it will shape the experience. So if you're going to take a psychedelic and it's just you want to get off your face and you want to have a recreational experience, and I've done everything else and I just want to do ayahuasca just to see what it's like, then that's your mindset. That's what you're going in with. And if you're going into the mindset with, well, whatever, then sure, whatever may show up and you may not be happy with whatever. So in my experience working with psychedelics, I always go in with an intention, because the intention shapes the experience. So the intention for me is the mindset. Now, another part of the mindset is not everybody's suitable for psychedelic experiences. Some people have very vulnerable psyches or psychological makeup, and a psychedelic experience could cause them a lot of distress, could even cause mental health issues, post-traumatic stress, dissociation, all sorts of problems. So the mindset is you want a robust, psychology. You want to be able to have that experience without it causing you harm. It's hard to know how to assess and vet people for that. But people with mental illness, they should be very careful using psychedelics.
So, but is it not being used for people with mental illness?
It is, but it's not suitable for everybody. There's no medicine that's suitable for everybody. So there's medicines for conditions. So, and I'm not saying I'm an expert in this. I do know people that have had bipolar illness, manic depressive illness, that have used ayahuasca and used it effectively. Although, the mainstream opinion is people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar, people with severe OCD, people with certain cluster B personality types should avoid psychedelics because it may cause more problems than it solves. And so there's no data set on this that is comprehensive enough to be able to make those calls. So in my opinion, the people who are best suited for psychedelic experiences are people who don't have severe mental illness. So I've had anxiety, I've had low mood, I've never had depression or suicide ideation, but I've had dissociation, I've had PTSD. Now those are amenable to psychedelic experiences, and I believe I've benefited from my psychedelic experiences. I've also come to harm from them as well. And so this is why, there's promises and pitfalls, and we need to really have long conversations about this so people come into this informed. So there's the mindset. Why am I doing this? Am I just a psychonaut and a psychedelic tourist and I've tried everything else, so I want to try this? Or I have this wound or this condition or this trauma that I'm wanting to heal. So that's the mindset. Then there's the setting. The setting seems to have an impact. So the setting is the physical setting. Some of these clinical trials are happening in hospital wards, in hospital rooms with, the person's wearing a white lab coat and they're hooked up to a blood pressure machine and there's, fluorescent lighting and they're in 4 walls. If you look at the shamanic traditions, most of these psychedelic experiences are done in the jungle, in nature, in natural settings. And in my opinion, the more natural, comfortable and safe the setting, although you could argue that the jungle's not safe.
Subjective.
Yeah. So the setting and the medicine are the 3 components of the
preparation phase.
Experience, yep. So, and vetting and assessing the person's suitability, looking out for contraindications. So there's mental health, medical conditions and medication contraindications to doing a psychedelic experience. So the person, and then preparing the person. So the best person to prepare someone for a psychedelic experience is someone who's had a psychedelic experience. Otherwise, how do you know how to prepare them? Once a person's prepared and they're willing to go ahead, and another part of that preparation is that people need to take responsibility, self-responsibility. So so when I went into the jungle and did ayahuasca, I was not going to hold the shaman responsible if I had a bad outcome. I was willing to take full responsibility for the fact that I'm there as a volunteer. I've done my research. I'm going to drink this jungle concoction, and if it turns out bad, that's on me. If it turns out good, that's on the shaman. No, that's also on me. So I'm willing to take full responsibility for the outcome of my adventure. So that's another important part of the preparation for a psychedelic experience. A person needs to be willing to take full responsibility for entering into that experience and the consequences of that experience. So then that's preparation. I'm sure there's other aspects of it. Initiation.
Obviously, then there's initiation, which is the experience.
Which is
itself.
the experience. Yeah. There's not much to say about that because you have to have the experience to know what that's all about. And it is an initiation. It's a rite of passage. You're going beyond where you've been before, and so through that, it is a rite of passage. You've passed through a threshold. You've gone into the unknown. So then the integration is, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do integration, or even that we have workable models for it. But the closest thing I've come up with, as I said before, is that all I've ever experienced in a psychedelic experience is different aspects of self. All the content that's in there, people say, I encountered beings and entities from other realms and other dimensions, and there was this other intelligence, and there was this nasty, dark entity that was messing with me. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. I don't see it that way. I take responsibility for all my creations, including the creations within my own psyche as I'm having a psychedelic experience and those aspects are being revealed to me, they're my creation. Yeah. And so
you're not you don't believe that when people are entering into when they're in a psychedelic journey, and the way that I see it is that in that experience, the reason why people are having these visions or these insights or accessing these things that they usually wouldn't is because it expands the frequency window that people are able to tap into. So usually, like what we were saying before, it's revealing, like with the towel, with the guy who took acid and became the towel. Consciousness is ever present, always, all the time, everywhere, all at once, able to ultimately, like, if we have that drop of pure divine God, consciousness, whatever people want to call it, that is all-knowing, all-powerful, everything. That is what creation came from. That is source. So every single thing comes from that place. So by having these experiences, what it's doing is actually opening us to be able to perceive more of what is always there. We're just not able to access it all the time. So do you see that the same way?
I do, yep.
So then when people are seeing these things, is that not to say that maybe those things, they're actually seeing these other, they are entities and they are other realms and other beings that they're able to perceive and access because the frequency window that they're susceptible to is so much bigger?
Yeah, okay. So if I understand your question correctly, I don't believe that the contents of a psychedelic experience include external entities, external to the self, beings that are other than self, that are from other dimensions.
So you don't think that people can pick up identities, quote unquote, pick up identities in a psychedelic experience?
Pick up entities, do you mean?
Yeah.
Like dark entities that are messing with them and be possessed by a dark entity?
Yeah, or any type, not dark necessarily, but any type.
Yeah, I don't believe that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I know there's, I've been around this, psychedelics for a couple of decades now, and that conversation is the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people talking about that, which is why I thought it would be good to ask. Yeah,
so and I haven't come across anybody besides myself who sees it in the same way I do. Mm-hmm. They're all just figments of my imagination. Mm-hmm. They're all my own creation. All those entities, they're my own darkness, my own shadow. They are archetypes of my own shadow. And I for the first decade and a half, I did believe that there were external entities that were messing with me, demonic things that were possessing me and fucking with me. Excuse the French. And I even had an encounter. I did a psychedelic journey on ayahuasca once where I went psychotic. That wasn't a very pleasant experience. And I experienced something called ontological shock, which is when you go from one way of being to another way of being, completely different way of being in 1 second. So I went from knowing myself as 55 years as sane to the next moment I'm completely insane, complete break from reality, causes ontological shock. One of the symptoms of ontological shock is PTSD. So I came out of that experience with PTSD.
How did you come out of that experience?
When the medicine wore off,
so you
the
were
psychosis went away.
Quote unquote insane while you were on the medicine.
Yeah. Now I'd done hundreds of ayahuasca journeys before that. In no other journey did I go insane. I always knew who I was and where I was and what was going on. But this was different. I became an alien version of myself. The world was completely alien to me. And I was under the impression that I'd cooked my noodle and I was going to be that way forever. So it was quite distressing. So I was in psychosis for 6 hours, and I now have empathy for people who experience psychosis. And when I came out of that experience, my perception or my belief, which formed from my perception, was that some dark entity had fucked with me, and that now I was being possessed by this. And for about 18 months I was experiencing like crippling dissociation, depersonalization, derealization, night sweats, nightmares, just horrible. And interestingly, at some point I made the connection that event had given me PTSD. I didn't realise that I was in post-traumatic stress. And so I found someone in the underground market here who does MDMA therapy for PTSD, and I had a MDMA session to cure myself of that PTSD. And within an hour of that session, my healing came when I was able to see that I wasn't a victim to something outside of myself. That was why I was in PTSD. I had a victim identity, that some dark malevolent force, I'd invited it into my soul, for lack of a better word, and that this dark soul was messing with me, you know, that the devil, the demonic, was, that I was a victim to this malevolence. And then it became quite clear to me that I volunteered for that. I'm not a victim, I'm a volunteer. I drank that ayahuasca. I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for the consequences of that. And so the consequences of that was psychosis. I'm responsible for my psychosis, not some dark malevolent entity outside of myself. So I just projected that there was a dark entity, malevolent entity messing with me. So the moment I was able to distinguish that I volunteered for that experience and that I wasn't a victim, all the symptoms went away. The depersonalization, derealization, dissociation, all that faded away. And in one session I healed myself of a condition I had for 18 months. And that showed me, or led me to believe what I believe now, which is that anything that you encounter in psychedelic experience is just a manifestation of self. Or revelation, sorry, not manifestation, a revelation of an aspect of self. That if you're willing to integrate and own and take responsibility for as a volunteer, you're never going to end up in the victim space of projecting some dark malevolence out there messing with you.
So in that moment when you had the breakthrough and your symptoms went away, was there a point where you chose to, you just chose that was going to be over now? You faced it, you saw it, and you were able to see it in that altered experience of the MDMA. So you were able to perceive it differently. And you, in that process of no longer being a victim to it and choosing to take self-responsibility, you chose to no longer have those symptoms, and you chose to no longer be playing out that experience because you said, I'm not a victim to this anymore, I'm choosing a different path. And that created the new experience and the symptoms went away. Do you relate to that? Was there a moment that you felt like you made a different choice in that process of no longer identifying as a victim?
Yeah, so I went into that session with the intention of hoping that my symptomology of my PTSD from that experience, that it would work, that I had no idea how it could or how it might. I just thought, I don't know where else to go. I've got the symptoms of PTSD, and I trust that this medicine is what treats PTSD. But I didn't know how I was going to go about that. Mm-hmm. It occurred to me in a flash once the medicine had kicked in. It wasn't long after the medicine had kicked in. So I was able to see more clearly, because prior to that, I was identifying as a victim. So there was no objective
You just
witness.
were it.
I was it.
You were it.
Yeah, I was a victim.
That was the truth. It was
the truth
just
was
simply
I'm a victim of this malevolent
absolutely,
thing.
yeah.
So there was none of this witness here.
Mm-hmm.
So when I had the MDMA, it's like, no, you're not a victim. There's nothing outside of you messing with you. You're a volunteer. You nobody made you drink that ayahuasca. You're not a victim of something outside of yourself. You took it. And when that was the consequence of that, you're also responsible for the consequence of that. That makes you a volunteer. There's a big difference in terms of how you feel about yourself if your perception of self is volunteer or victim.
So in some ways, you almost acknowledged your power.
Yeah, I took my power back.
The reason why I'm pulling on this is because from a different perspective, which is the way I would see it, which is, I mean, same outcome, same journey, just different lens, is that hypothetically, if it was an identity outside of you, as long as you believed that that identity or that entity had control over you, it did, because we live based on natural law. If you've looked into that at all, based on natural law, this is a consent-based realm. So there is nothing, we are the most powerful force that exists. We have this connection to the creator, and we are it goes into stuff like for a mainstream perspective, what's his name? The guy that does all of the mind-based like visualization healing stuff. He's on Gaia. What's his name?
DeMartini or Joe Dispenza.
Joe Dispenza. Like that kind of understanding that we are fully capable of creating everything. We have infinite potential for creation because we have the connection to God.
But does he include malevolence in that? We can create absolute malevolence?
Well, we can consent to it. In my opinion, we are pure consciousness experiencing this reality which comes with identities that are not us, because I believe we're the pure consciousness, we're pure spirit, that is pure divine love. And then we pick up these identities, entities, and we identify with them and we believe that we are them. And as long as we believe that we are them, we're consenting to them having control over us. We're consenting to that power guiding us. As soon as we can go, hold on, actually, that's not me. I know who I am. I know where I've come from. I know what I am made up of. I know I am the soul that is infinitely powerful and intelligent. There is nothing greater than that power. And I can embody that and know that and stop consenting to other things. There is nothing that can match that level of pure potential. And so when you're telling the story, the way that I see that is like, as soon as you went, hold on, no, like this doesn't have power over me. This isn't, like, absolutely not. I chose this. I am the creator. I get to stop creating this.
Yeah.
Then it lost all power because you stopped consenting.
I like that. I like that term consent. I'm just thinking about from an etymological point of view. Sent is like sentient, which is awareness or consciousness. Con means with. So consent means with awareness.
Yeah, exactly. And, what you were doing in that, you weren't actually consenting, because consent, again, is conscious. You were assenting, which is unconscious consent, because you haven't consciously not consented. So
yes,
most people are assenting all the time in their life.
Leaving themselves open.
Yes, because they haven't taken the time to become conscious and choose whether they do consent or they don't consent. So assenting is assumed consent because they haven't decided on one or the other.
Yeah. So that's great. So thank you for bringing that conversation to my attention, because it highlights for me, in terms of my understanding of working with my shadow self, is that I believe I'm capable of all things: malevolence, harm, like I said before, rape, murder, all of it. I saw that. I'm also capable of, divine benevolent action as well. And that what keeps me on the straight and narrow, and not, on the path to heaven and not hell, is consent in that, or where I place my attention, and that I choose to consent to the benevolence.
Exactly.
And knowing that I'm potentially and capable of malevolence, because I'm conscious of that.
And then you're choosing not to consent to it.
Correct.
And if you do need it, then you go, I consent to being that way now.
Yeah, if someone was coming through the
Yes.
window at 2 a.m. and I needed to take
Exactly.
that person out rather than die, I could consent to being violent
Yes.
and malevolent. Yeah.
Yes. Just to add another dimension.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like this has been a very long conversation. Where are we
has.
at? 1:30. That makes it 2 hours.
I think we'll wind it up here.
Cool.
But it almost begs a second one because
We opened a lot of doors.
we opened a lot of doors, we did. And we definitely veered off the planned trajectory, which, as I said, you had complete license to do. And it went somewhere, but I'm not unhappy with where it went. It was good to be challenged on my position, and I definitely struggled to support my position, and I'm fine with that because I want to be able to support my position on most things. But I do like having these kind of long form conversations because it's not about the destination so much, but the journey of opening and expanding awareness and consciousness about these kind of topics. And
Absolutely. And all we're ever doing is just giving people seeds to reflect back to them what's already known and what they're ready to, like you can't give anyone knowledge. You're just reflecting something back to them that then is going to grow something within them. So, yeah, like who knows what we've spoken about today that's going to unfurl for people and where that's going to take them. Maybe there was so much in what we talked about that's going to assist people in coming to an embodied understanding of psychedelic integration and integration in general. That yes, we didn't go right there to the point. We didn't give them a path or direction or anything, but even more powerfully, they'll be able to come to something on their own that's like fully integrated within them. It's not just knowledge that they've consumed. I had a little giggle midway through because I was like, wow, I said that I wasn't going to do this and then it just happened anyway. But I did warn you, so it's okay. You were fully aware that this is where the conversation may have gone. I'm still curious if you think it would be more beneficial to have the psychedelic integration conversation with somebody who sees things more like just that you can just bounce off with back and forth, because I think fundamentally, like, I am going to challenge a lot of things, and it is going to, in some ways, just create, it's not going to be like a complete strong piece of information for people that just want to know about psychedelic integration and what this new legislation is going to mean. Like maybe people just want to know about the legislation, they want to know what you think about that, and just have that really direct, concise piece of work rather than going on this whole journey, which is so beneficial in its own way. But I don't know if I'm the right person for that conversation to emerge.
Sure. And so can I just, what's your position on psychedelics? For, against, neither?
I mean, I'm not going to say against. I think everybody is going to find exactly what they're meant to find on their journey based on what they need, what their unique karmic destiny is. I don't think that there's not a right or wrong. I personally don't take psychedelics. I don't think I ever will again in my life. I have taken psilocybin quite a lot. I've had cannabis, and that's it, I think. But yeah, in my opinion, kind of like what I was saying before, knowing that we are the most powerful creators with untapped potential, if we can make it conscious, if we can remove more and more of the filters and the identities and all this stuff that's blocking us from knowing who we truly are, we have the greatest technology that we don't need anything outside of us to access that on our own. And I think that I believe in reincarnation, and whether, maybe I think that taking psychedelics is shortcutting to awareness that otherwise somebody might take a psychedelic and access this level of awareness or whatever they're accessing in that journey, that if they were on that path of reaching that level of conscious naturally through meditation and through practices that are activating their own technology within their body, might take them lifetimes to get to that point. And in that process, there is not going to be any of this breakdown of identity or whatever it is. It's going to be completely integrated, completely whole, and there is no risk of things of coming out in like a way that's harmful or problematic or whatever it is.
Yep.
And so I believe that we already have everything that we need, and we've been given everything that we need to reach exactly what we're meant to reach within this lifetime, next, da-da-da-da-da. And yeah,
Another question. Thank you. Shadow integration, for, against, neutral?
Well, I think my perspective on this has kind of changed because I discovered somebody called John Mace, who is, he created a philosophy, I don't know if that's what you would call it, called causism. And I agree with referring to shadow as, I believe that there is a shadow in that there is stuff that is unconscious within us. That I agree with. I don't believe that those are aspects of us. I don't believe that we are our shadow and we are our ego. I believe that we are pure consciousness, and we create identities which are positive and negative in that they either serve us or they harm us. So like, a harmful negative identity could be one that abuses drugs, or one that abuses animals, or gets put into prison all the time because of behavior. So I believe that we have these identities which are not us, but we identify with them. As long as we are humans in this body, in this experience, we're always going to have identities, or we would be dead, we wouldn't exist, we wouldn't be able to function. The identities help us to do everything. So they help us to have a job. There's a working identity and there's this identity, and these are all identities that are not us. So as long as we're identifying with the shadow being me, I have this part of me, we're actually identifying with aspects. Well, we're identifying with more of something that actually isn't us. And the more that we identify with it, the less ability there is to clear it and to no longer have that aspect running our lives.
Yeah, I don't believe we are our shadow and our ego. I believe that we can be imbued with the spirit of either. So an aspect of my shadow might be mean or cruel. So when I'm being mean or cruel, I'm allowing the spirit of meanness and cruelness to inhabit me in that moment. Doesn't mean I am those things, but I can be them, or I can exhibit those. So I take your point on psychedelics, and Jung was very clear about this too. He calls them unearned wisdom.
Yeah, well, I remember the first day that I ever came into work with you, I saw that you'd written that quote on your About page, and I was like, oh, I totally agree with that. And you were like, oh, well, I don't fully, I think there is a place for them. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah,
so I agree with you on that. There are no shortcuts. So people do psychedelics, and people are going to continue to do psychedelics, and they may even do them more as they become legal. Where I position myself now in regard to this, I don't do psychedelics anymore. It's rare that I go near a psychedelic. I've had plenty of experiences. I don't feel like I need to have any more. I feel like I've earned my wisdom from psychedelics. It's not unearned. Whether I've got wisdom about it, that's, debatable. But where I position myself now is that what psychedelics have given me is an understanding of the shadow. And so I guess what I can offer is that a caution against using psychedelics. Also, maybe a place where people can come if they have a so-called bad trip or they're looking for help to integrate their psychedelic experience, and a model for psychedelic integration being, well, what we're really doing is just needing to integrate these aspects of self. And so that's why I'm on the path I am, because I see the pitfalls. I've fallen down those holes and got myself out of them. And so I'm in a position, I think, to guide people who are looking to do shadow integration or psychedelic integration on giving them at least some model for that. So, yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Quinn, for being in this conversation with me, and I'm glad it went where it went.
Good job to everyone who made it this far.
Yeah.
If you made it this far, leave a comment. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. All feedback is always so encouraged and welcome. So, yeah, thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Pete Isaia is an Australian trauma therapist and integration coach. You can find him at isaiahcoaching.com and connect with him on Instagram at isaiahcoaching. This podcast was produced by Quinika Davis, edited by Beck Isaia and Luca Young, and the score was produced by Joshua Richards.